Hello and welcome back to a new episode of Century of Lights. One of the myths about the Enlightenment, which the people who lived through it certainly believed themselves, was that it saw the end of superstition. People were much less likely to believe that, say, kings could cure diseases with their touch, or that the finger of a long-dead saint at a local shrine could help barren women get pregnant. But progress rarely happens evenly in history. Even the cutting-edge medical theories of the 17th and 18th centuries, whose doctors prided themselves on their use of reason and willingness to experiment instead of just following ancient authorities, gave rise to some pretty weird ideas. Consider the case of Mary Toft, an English farm girl who was examined by the King of England's own doctors because she claimed she was giving birth to rabbit parts. A leg here, a head there. Eventually she had to admit it was faked. Just don't think about how she faked it. Or look at Franz Anton Mesmer, who claimed that, thanks to something called animal magnetism, he could cure back pain, blindness, and even mental illness by running magnets along someone's body. At least Mesmer was debunked, but only after the French government held an official inquiry into his practices. The main medical threat that 18th century doctors had to wage war against was onanism, masturbation. Even though the sin of Onan in the Old Testament had more to do with disobedience than with touching one's own genitalia. The threat of onanism was first given a name in a small pamphlet with a big title, Onania, or the heinous sin of self-pollution and all its frightful consequences in both sexes considered, with spiritual and physical advice to those who have already injured themselves by this abominable practice, and seasonable admonition to the youth of the nation of both sexes. That was the full title. Written in or around 1712, the pamphlet warns about how this particular sin is worse than even sodomy, because it is so easy to indulge in. Quote, whilst yielding to filthy imagination, they endeavor to imitate and procure for themselves that sensation which God has ordered to attend the carnal commerce of the two sexes for the continuance of our species. The tract proved to have such a tremendous impact that as early as 1726, onanism became a word in the English dictionary. Despite the moral tones of the pamphlet, ultimately the remedies offered were not just prayer. Instead, the author, after consulting an unnamed physician, suggested buying a strengthening tincture and a prolific powder to the victims of the disease. It was, as the historian Thomas Lacour writes, a shameless effort to invent a new disease and at the same time offer its cure. In spite of its shady beginnings, the hysteria over onanism took on an unstoppable life of its own. One German schoolmaster, C.G. Salzmann, wrote an entire book on how the male students under his charge succumbed to the horrors of masturbation. One letter written to Salzmann from a 13-year-old boy confesses, "I did it without any sense of it being bad." The British author, Bernard de Menville, who was no prude, argued in a pamphlet that one of the benefits of keeping brothels around was that it would discourage young men from masturbation. Prostitution could at least be watched and controlled. Masturbation, since it was free and easy to do and could always be done in private, could not be so easily controlled. One of the celebrated voices about the onanism menace was a Swiss physician, Samuel Auguste Tissot. A true medical celebrity, Tissot's work on masturbation, advice to the people on their health, was translated into virtually every European language. Alongside the latest medical theories, Tissot offered heartbreaking and tragic accounts of patients who had their lives destroyed by their addiction to masturbation. Many were young men who did not stop their ugly habits until it was too late, and found themselves now suffering blindness, fatigue, memory loss, and even paralysis. One patient from 1755 wrote, "I certainly feel that this evil action has diminished the strength of my faculties, especially that of my memory. The next year, another patient claimed, "If religion did not restrain me, I would have already put an end to my life, cruelly ravaged as it is though my own fault." Tissot was especially inspired by the case of a young watchmaker, whom he referred to as L.D. Quote, "L.D., watchmaker, had been good and had enjoyed good health up until the age of 17. At this period, he began to masturbate, an act which he reiterated daily, and often as many as 3 times a day. Before a year had passed, he began to notice a great weakness after each act. This warning was not sufficient to pull him from the mire. His soul, already given over to this filth, was no longer capable of other ideas, and the repetitions of his crime became daily more frequent, until he found himself in a state where he feared death was imminent." Now, this wasn't completely new. Medieval moralists considered masturbation to be a sin too, although they were often a lot more tolerant of masturbation in girls, since girls were considered naturally more lustful than boys, and at least one medieval physician actually thought masturbation was a useful way for girls to cool off their natural lust. However, masturbation was just one of many sexual sins that let people have sexual pleasure for fun, and not for the God-intended purpose of making babies. But this was the first time masturbation was talked about as a crisis, and as a medical, not exclusively a moral crisis at that. These ideas weren't just isolated to some medical fringe either, but were shared by many of the leading and most revolutionary intellectuals of the Enlightenment. The same people who tended to criticize traditional Christian morality of putting unrealistic standards on people's sexual natures. Pioneering feminist Mary Wollstonecraft thought a major problem was that schoolboys were allowed to engage in, quote, "nasty indecent tricks that weaken their bodies and, quote, very early pollute the mind." Johann Georg Zimmermann, who was an acquaintance of Goethe and Kant and nearly the entire German intellectual community of the late 18th century, published an article fretting that, horror of horrors, girls masturbated as much as boys. In 1751, Diderot's groundbreaking encyclopedia had an article on masturbation, or menstruation, as it was called, that solemnly warned that masturbation is the source of countless diseases. There is no one who has not experienced how, even when it is not taken too far, it weakens, and such apathy, illness, and trouble follows the sexual act when it is repeated a little too often. The nerves are the parts that appear primarily affected, and nerve diseases are the most common consequences of this too excessive evacuation. Finally, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who himself admitted to masturbating in his Confessions, a passage that's usually taken out of editions of the book, especially ones for kids in school and college. Rousseau warned in Emile, his guide to how to educate young boys, that if a boy succumbs to the temptation to masturbate even just once, quote, he is lost. This fad didn't go away soon, and actually lasted throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th as a basic fact of medicine. Even today, the main reason boys in the United States are circumcised is because in the 19th century, American doctors sought it helped discourage the urge to masturbate. 19th century literature and medical guides even assumed you could spot a chronic masturbator from any crowd. Thomas Lacour cites one description: pale, desiccated limbs, hollow chest, powerless sunken head, dead white face, eyelids falling powerlessly over his dying, fading eyes. The lessons you can take from this are rather grim. Even people who see themselves as advancing progress don't always actually advance progress. And even ideas that have no basis in any fact or experiment can become the new intellectual orthodoxy and stay that way for generations. On the other hand, ideas do eventually change. And even if it took a long time getting there, most of us now have the freedom to, well, enjoy ourselves. So join us next time when we talk about religion and the Enlightenment. Specifically, a best-selling author who said the second coming of Christ actually happened in the 18th century. If no one noticed, it was because it happened entirely on the spiritual plane. See you next time.